begin with our discussion on anesthesia. So as it is the beginning, we'll start with the history of anesthesia. Here you have to remember 3 points, which comes as MCQs in your NEET PG exams. First, who is the father of modern anesthesia? Second, who is the father of spinal anesthesia? And third, who was the first person to give N2 demonstration? Now, the father of modern anesthesia is W.T.G. Morton. And why he was the father of modern anesthesia? Because he was the first person who has done demonstration of ether in front of the audience. Now, there have been scientists who have done the public demonstration of ether, but in public demonstration, W.T.G. Morton was the first person, and that is why he was called as the father of modern anesthesia. Now, this day, that is 16th October, is celebrated as the World Anesthesia Day because this incident of the public demonstration of anesthesia in front of the audience was done on 16th October 1846 for the first time by W.T.G. Morton. Second question, which comes as MCQs, who is the father of spinal anesthesia? August Bayer, he was the person because he was the first person to give spinal anesthesia. And there are other things also which August Bayer has done, that he has given IVRA. What is IVRA? IVRA is intravenous region anesthesia. That is also called as Bayer block. Now, the third MCQ which comes, the first person to give N2 demonstration was Horace Wales. So you have to remember 3 scientists' names: W.T.G. Morton, the father of modern anesthesia; August Bayer, father of spinal anesthesia; and Horace Wales, who was the first person to give N2 demonstration. Next up is the techniques of anesthesia. Now, in broad classification, there are 2 techniques of anesthesia. One is the local anesthetics, and the second one is the general anesthesia. Under local anesthetics, you further have the local anesthesia, the spinal anesthesia, the epidural anesthesia, and the peripheral nerve block. Now, why I have classified this into 2 broad categories? Because in local anesthetics, the patient is conscious, which means if you are giving local anesthesia, spinal anesthesia, epidural anesthesia, or the peripheral nerve block, the patient is conscious. But in case of general anesthesia, the patient is unconscious. So it belongs to a different technique of anesthesia. Now, we will do the PAC, that is the pre-anesthetic checkup. So here you have to know that when we do PAC, why we do PAC, and how we do PAC. So first, when do we do PAC? PAC is done before surgery, okay? Because in surgery, you need to anesthetize the patient, so you have to do a pre-anesthetic checkup before surgery. Why is it done? Because we want to check if the patient is fit for anesthesia or not. Because as I told you, that in surgery, you have to anesthetize the patient. So first, before giving anesthesia, you have to check whether the patient is fit for anesthesia or not. That is why you have to do a pre-anesthetic checkup. Now, the components, that means how we do the PAC. So basically, there are 4 components. One is you have to check the hemoglobin. Second, you have to do the airway assessment. Third, you have to check the fasting status of the person. And fourth, you have to check if there is any history of comorbidities or any medicines that the patient takes. Now, under hemoglobin, the minimum hemoglobin should be 10. If it is less than 10, you cannot give anesthesia to the patient. It has to be more than 10. Only then the patient is classified as anesthetic fit individual. Second, you have to do the airway assessment, and this is the most important thing. I will take up this topic in a few minutes in details. You have to check the fasting status of the patient. Why? To prevent any risk of aspiration. And fourth, you have to check if there is any history of comorbidities, any chronic illness, or any medicine that the patient takes. Because there are various medicines which need to be stopped before surgery or stopped before giving anesthesia. That is why you have to do that. Okay. Now, as I told you, that airway assessment is the most important step. So first you have to know that why is airway assessment the most important step. There were other points also which I told you in pre-anesthetic checkup, like hemoglobin check the fasting status, check if there is any comorbidities. Why I am stressing on the airway management? Why? Because after giving anesthesia, most patients die because of the failure to intubate. So you have to check whether the airway is patent or not. Because if the airway is not patent, then you have to give outside modes of ventilation to the patient. And the second reason why airway assessment is most important, because after giving anesthesia, most of the patients go into respiratory distress. So if the airway is patent, then you can give intubation also to save the patient. Okay, I hope I made it clear why airway assessment is most important. Now, how to do the airway assessment? So there is basically a full procedure. First, you have to open the mouth of the patient in a chin up position. Okay, so basically the patient is supine. You will open the mouth of the patient in the chin up position. Then you have to do the Malapathy classification. I will come to the Malapathy classification in a few minutes. But first you have to know that what is Malapathy classification. So it is basically used to check if all the structures in the larynx are visualized or not. Okay. After doing the Malapathy classification, you will look for the interincisor distance. What is the interincisor distance? This is the distance between the upper and the lower incisors. Okay. After that, you will ask the patient to lift up the chin. As I told you, the patient has to lift up the chin. When you are doing this, 2 distances have to be checked. First, the thyromental distance. What is this thyromental distance? This is the distance between thyroid cartilage and the mentum. That is thyromental, thyroid cartilage and the mentum. And second, you have to check the sternomental distance. What is the sternomental distance? It is the distance between the sternal notch and the mentum. So basically, if I tell you how to do the airway classification, you will first ask the patient supine, open the mouth of the patient, check for the Malapathy classification. After this is done, you will check the interincisor distance. Then you will ask the patient to lift the chin up. After the chin is lifted up, you will measure these 2 distances, thyromental and sternomental distance. Now, why these measurements are important? Because these measurements give you an idea whether the airway is patent or not. For example, the interincisor distance is normally 4 to 5 centimeter. If it is less than that, you can just understand that the area in which you are going to intubate is very less, and you will have a problem in intubation if the patient faces respiratory distress after anesthesia. Second, thyromental distance. Normally it is more than 6.5 centimeter, and sternomental distance is more than 12.5 centimeter. So if any of these distances are short, which means that you have to intubate in a very short area, which will be a difficult procedure. So you do the airway assessment to check for these distances. Okay. Now let me discuss with you the Malapathy classification. Okay. Now, as I told you, why is Malapathy classification done? It is done to check if you are being able to visualize all the structures clearly or not. So basically, there are 5 classes: class 0, class 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 classes under Malapathy classification. Okay. What does class 1 mean? Class 1 means that the hard palate, the soft palate, and the uvula, and the tip of the uvula, and the tonsillar pillars are seen clearly. So as I told you, you will ask the patient to go supine. Open the mouth of the patient. If you open the mouth of the patient and you can see the structures like hard palate, soft palate, uvula, the tip of the uvula, the tonsillar pillars, which means that you are able to visualize all the structures clearly, and this is the Malapathy class 1. What is class 2? Class 2 is when you are able to visualize the hard palate, the soft palate, the uvula, the tonsillar pillars, but you are not being able to visualize the tip of the uvula. What does it mean? This means that the airways space is good enough, but not very good, because you can't see the tip of the uvula. What does class 3 mean? Class 3 mean you can see only the hard palate and the soft palate, and you cannot see the uvula, the tip of the uvula, and the tonsillar pillars. Now, from class 3 onwards, it means that there is very less space to put the laryngoscope inside, to intubate the patient. Okay. And class 4 is you can see only the hard palate and no other structures like soft palate, uvula, tip of uvula, tonsillar pillars are seen. And what is class 0? Class 0 is all the class 1 structures plus the tip of the epiglottis can also be seen, which is a very good space to intubate the patient or to put the laryngoscope inside if the patient is in respiratory distress after giving anesthesia. So I hope I was able to explain you the significance of Malapathy classification. In short, you have to just remember that class 0, 1, 2 are good classes. You can put a laryngoscope inside. But after visualizing, after opening the mouth, if you can see that it is class 3 and class 4 Malapathy classification, you cannot put the laryngoscope space inside because the space is very less. Okay. Now, I also told you about the interincisor distance, right? The distance between the upper and the lower incisor, which is normally 4 to 5 centimeters. Now, if the IID, that is interincisor distance, is less than 4 to 5 centimeters, then you cannot do a laryngoscopy. You have to do a tracheostomy only. Now, this was about the airway assessment. Now, we will move on to another thing, that is the fasting status. Now, hemoglobin part is clear, I hope. It has to be more than 10 or equal to 10 if the patient is categorized as anesthetic fit patient. For airway assessment, you have to check the Malapathy classification and you have to check the 3 distances which I told you, that is the interincisor distance, the sternomental distance, and the thyromental distance. Now, in fasting status, what did I say you? I told you that this is important to prevent a risk of aspiration. In case of adult, liquid should be stopped 2 hours before anesthetic checkup or before surgery. Semi-solid must be stopped 6 hours before giving anesthesia, and solid food must be stopped 8 hours before giving anesthesia. And in case of children, 2 hours for liquid. If the patient or the child is in breast milk, then 4 hours should be a gap between the feed of the mother and the anesthetic checkup. And formula feed is for 6 hours. Okay. Now we will move on to the comorbidities and medicines which need to be stopped before anesthesia, before surgery. Now there are some medicines which need to be stopped before surgery for pre-anesthetic checkup, and there are certain medicines which can be continued. Here are the medicines which has to be stopped, and these are the medicines which can be continued. So you can remember those medicines which can be stopped before surgery by a mnemonic that is called as HOT MLC women. HOT MLC women. HOT HOT MLC MLC women. WOMEN. Now from H you have 2 medicines, that is the heparin and the herbal medicines. Okay. From O you have oral hypoglycemic agents. From T you have tricyclic antidepressants and tilopidine. From M you have monoamine oxidase inhibitors. L lithium. C clopidogrel. W warfarin. O OCPs. Okay. Now you also have to know that what is the time interval before you can stop this, or what is the time up to which you can take these medicines, but after this period of time you cannot take this medicine before surgery for PAC. For example, in heparin it is 6 hours. That means if you take heparin now at, let's say, 12 o'clock noon, then you can perform your surgery after 6 hours, that is 6 PM onwards from the evening. Okay, I hope I can make it clear to you. Herbal medicines is 6 weeks. That means you have to stop the herbal medicine 6 weeks prior to surgery. Oral hypoglycemic agents is on the particular day of surgery, you have to stop it. OCPs 3 to 4 weeks. Tricyclic antidepressants 3 to 4 weeks. Tilopidine 14 days, that means 2 weeks. Monoamine oxidase inhibitor 3 to 4 weeks. So there are 3 medicines for 3 to 4 weeks. OCPs, TCA, MOA inhibitors. Lithium is 24 to 48 hours, that means 1 to 2 days. Clopidogrel is 8 days and warfarin is 3 to 5 days. Okay. Now which are the medicines which can be continued before surgery? You have aspirin, but a low dose aspirin, that is only 75 milligram. You can have anti-anginal drugs, anti-epileptic drugs, anti-thyroid drugs, anti-lipidemic drugs as well. Okay. So this completes our pre-anesthetic checkup, which has 4 components. Hemoglobin should be more than equal to 10. Airway assessment, the medicines which need to be stopped and which can be continued, and lastly, the fasting status of the individual. Now we will see the post-PAC. What happens post the pre-anesthetic checkup? So the ASA, that is the American Society Anesthesia, has given a classification for the post-anesthetic checkup. There are 6 classes under this. What is the first class? First class is the patient has no systemic illness. The second class is that the patient has a systemic illness, but he is in a well-controlled state. Class 3 means patient is having systemic illness, but he is not under control. Class 4 means the patient is having a systemic illness, which is a constant threat to life. This can be a coronary artery disease or a case of recent stroke. Class 5 means it is a moribund patient. That means a patient with multiple comorbidities. And class 6 means a brain dead patient. Okay. So after PAC, you have to check what class the patient is falling into. And these are the 6 classes given by the ASA. This is done to check the overall health status of the patient. Now there is something called as emergency post-anesthetic checkup also. Okay. This is particularly for the patients who are under emergency. For them, you cannot put these classes. You have to keep that patient under ASA-A, that is American Society Anesthesia, E for emergency. That is what is written here. Now, we will start with a very broad topic, that is the techniques of anesthesia. I told you that there are basically 2 techniques of anesthesia under broad classification. The first technique is when the patient is conscious, and the second technique is when the patient is not conscious. When the patient is conscious, that is classified under local anesthetics, in which you have the local anesthesia, the spinal anesthesia, the epidural anesthesia, and the nerve block. And the second category is when the patient is not conscious. That belongs to the category of general anesthesia. But before that, you have to know what does anesthesia mean. Anesthesia basically means a loss of pain sensation. Now, let us move into local anesthetics, in which it specifically means that there is reversible loss of pain sensation and the patient is in a conscious state. As I told you repeatedly, that there are 4 things which come under local anesthetics. One is the local anesthesia itself, the second is the spinal anesthesia, the third is the epidural anesthesia, and the fourth is the nerve block. Now, before going into details of these, you should know in one line what these things mean. Now, local anesthesia, what does local mean? Local means a small area. Anesthesia means a loss of pain sensation. That means local anesthesia means that there is a small area which has been, or there is a local area which has experienced a loss of pain sensation. There is a local area which has been made numb of pain. What is spinal anesthesia and what is epidural anesthesia? Spinal anesthesia, you have to know, has to be given in those surgeries which are below umbilicus, short duration surgeries. And epidural anesthesia is given under those surgeries which are below umbilicus but long duration surgeries. And lastly, we will do the nerve block where we block a particular segment of the nerve. Let's delve deep into the local anesthesia first. There is specifically a classic mechanism of action of local anesthesia. It works basically by inhibiting the sodium channels present at your neuromuscular junction. Okay, so basically a neuromuscular junction is the terminal part of a nerve. Just imagine in your head or a circuit that there is a nerve, there is a neuromuscular junction, and then there is a muscle. Okay, so nerve, muscle, and in between them you have a neuromuscular junction. So in the neuromuscular junction there are sodium channels. In other words, I can say that at the terminal part of your nerve there are sodium channels. If the sodium channels are blocked, then the impulse will not be conducted to the muscle and the muscle will be anesthetized. This is exactly the mechanism of local anesthesia. These drugs will block the sodium channels at your NMJ or at your nerve terminals. They will prevent the depolarization, they will prevent the impulse conduction, and hence your muscle will be anesthetized. Now, there are 2 types or 2 forms of local anesthesia. One is the non-ionized form and the second one is the ionized form. Ionized, as it is saying ion, which means it is something related to ions. So the ionized forms will block the ion channels, will block the sodium channels, but the non-ionized form will enter into the nerve terminal. Okay. Now we will move on to the category of the local anesthesia. There are 2 categories, that is amino esters and amino acids. You have to learn the examples of these drugs and certain points about these drugs as well. First, amino esters. So in the word amino esters, you have 1 I. So you can remember that those drugs which have 1 I will come under amino esters. Okay, this is just a way of remembering. Amino ester, 1 I, and these are the drugs which are also having 1 I, and these are amino esters. That is cocaine, procaine, tetracaine, benzocaine, and chlorprocaine. Next is amino amides. Amino amides is 2 I, right? So those drugs which will not be having 1 I, or rather those drugs which will be having 2 I's will come under amino amides. Okay, what are those drugs which are amino amides? These are the drugs: lignocaine, C2I, lignocaine, ropivacaine, bupivacaine, prilocaine, dibucaine. So just remember these 5 drugs: lignocaine, ropivacaine, bupivacaine, prilocaine, dibucaine. And in amino esters, you have to remember again 5 drugs: cocaine, procaine, tetracaine, benzocaine, and chlorprocaine. Now, as I told you, we have to remember certain specific points about these drugs. First, let's come to cocaine. To know the specific points about each of the amino esters. Let's start with cocaine. You have to know that cocaine is used in eye surgery and as a spinal anesthesia. Next up is procaine. Procaine is used in malignant hyperthermia. What is malignant hyperthermia? Malignant, which means abnormal. Hyper means more. Thermia means temperature. So abnormal increase in temperature is called as malignant hyperthermia, where procaine can be used. Third, you have to know about chloroprocaine, that it is the shortest acting amino esters. Now one thing is common in all of these amino esters, that they all are allergic. Why they are allergic? Because they are metabolized by the pseudocholinesterase enzyme in the plasma to form PABA, that is para-aminobenzoic acid. Now this PABA is like an allergen, so the amino esters are allergic. Also about cocaine, you have to remember two more things, like I told you, that is used in eye surgery and spinal anesthesia. You also have to remember that was the first introduced local anesthesia, and it is never given intravenously. Why? Because it can cause severe vasoconstriction. So 4 points about cocaine, that it is used in eye surgery, it is used as spinal anesthesia, it was the first introduced local anesthesia, and you should never give it IV because it causes severe vasoconstriction. For procaine, you have to remember one thing, that it can be used in malignant hyperthermia, and for all the amino esters, you should remember that they are allergic. Okay, now we move on to aminoamides. As I told you, aminoamides have 2 I, so the examples of the drugs will also have 2 I. Okay, let's start with lignocaine. Lignocaine, you have to remember many points about lignocaines. What are those? It was the most common worldwide local anesthesia to be used. Not was, but still now it is the most common local anesthesia that is used worldwide. Second, it is the most common used local anesthesia in IVRA, intravenous regional anesthesia. Now, in the start of the discussion, there was a part where I used the term IVRA. What was that? Yes, guys, anyone? Just remind yourself in the brain. Yes, August Bayer. He was the first person to have given IVRA, and he was known as the father of spinal anesthesia. Very good. Okay, lignocaine, you have to remember that it causes malignant hyperthermia. So procaine was a drug which was safe in malignant hyperthermia, but lignocaine causes malignant hyperthermia, and lignocaine also causes CNS toxicity, right? Now, about ropivacaine, there is no such specific thing that you have to remember. For bupivacaine, there are again 4 points, that it is the most common used local anesthesia in spinal anesthesia. So whenever you're giving a spinal anesthesia, if you have to give a local anesthesia, give bupivacaine. Second, it is the longest acting. But it is longer acting than lignocaine. This question can come in your mind, that ma'am, if lignocaine is the most commonly used local anesthesia, why use bupivacaine? Because bupivacaine is longer acting than lignocaine. And third point, you have to know that it is the most cardiotoxic aminoamides. Okay, what you should know about prilocaine? That prilocaine is used as surface anesthesia purpose. So there is a cream called as EMLA cream, that is eutetic mixture of local anesthesia. There are 2 local anesthesia in the EMLA cream. One is the prilocaine and one is the lignocaine. 2 to 5% prilocaine, 2 to 5% lignocaine. This mixture forms EMLA cream, and this EMLA cream is used in child when you are giving IV cannula. Okay, and the third point you have to know about prilocaine is that it is used in IVRA along with lignocaine. Correct? So 3 things about prilocaine: the EMLA cream usage, it is used as a spinal anesthesia, surface anesthesia, and third, it is used in IVRA. Now you should remember that prilocaine is contraindicated in neonates. It is written in red. Why? Because it causes methemoglobinemia. Now, methemoglobinemia also occurs in adults, and we know methemoglobinemia is a severe condition. But in neonates, there is more chance of methemoglobinemia. Why? Because neonates have already fetal hemoglobin. So, prilocaine increases the further risk of methemoglobinemia in neonates, so we avoid that. For debucaine, what you have to remember, that it is the longest acting local anesthesia, but it is not used in many places. It is just used as a debucaine test. Now, as lignocaine is the most important here, you have to know 2 more things about lignocaine. First, the dose of the lignocaine, and second, about the lignocaine toxicity. Now, if you're giving lignocaine plain, that is, if you're giving only lignocaine, you have to give 4.5 mg per kg. But if you're giving lignocaine with adrenaline, you have to give 7 mg per kg. Okay? Now, what is called as lignocaine toxicity? If you give more than 4.5 mg per kg plain lignocaine, more than this, then there will be some symptoms of lignocaine toxicity. What are those? Those are, first of all, there will be perioral numbness. That means around the mouth there will be numbness. Second, there will be tremors. Third, there will be seizures. Fourth, there will be respiratory arrest. And fifth, there will be cardiac arrest. Okay? Now, if there is seizures, you can give anti-epileptic drugs. If the patient is having respiratory distress, you can intubate or ventilate the patient. If the patient is having cardiac arrest, you can give adrenaline. But specifically, to manage these symptoms overall, there is a 20% intralipid solution that is given in case of lignocaine toxicity. Okay? So, this was all about the local anesthetics. We started with 2 forms, amino esters, aminoamides. We did the examples under them and the specific points that you have to remember under them. Now, if local anesthetics is done, we have to further move to other forms of local anesthetics, that is spinal anesthesia, epidural anesthesia, nerve block. Now, we have to study those things like spinal anesthesia, epidural anesthesia, and the nerve block under a category of regional anesthesia. Why? Because, as I told you, local anesthesia means a local area that has been made numb of pain. In regional anesthesia, it means that a particular region has been made numb of pain. So, we will study this under regional anesthesia. But here also, you have to remember that patient remains in a conscious state. Okay, so that basic which I told you, the techniques of anesthesia are divided into 2 categories. First, the patient is unconscious, the patient is conscious. In the patient is unconscious, it is only general anesthesia. But if the patient is conscious, there is a local anesthesia, there is a general anesthesia. In local anesthesia, we have done already the aminoamides and the amino esters, and under regional anesthesia, now we are proceeding. Regional anesthesia is again of two types, central neuraxial block and the peripheral nerve block. In central neuraxial block, you have spinal anesthesia, epidural anesthesia, saddle anesthesia, and caudal anesthesia. And in peripheral nerve block, you have again four types, brachial plexus block, stellate ganglion block, femoral plexus block, and ankle block. Now let's study each of these in detail, or what is important from the MCQ point of view. Spinal anesthesia. First of all, spinal anesthesia is a misnomer because you might think that this anesthesia is given on the spinal cord. No, it is not given on the spinal cord. So where is it given? It is given in a place that is below the spinal cord. It is given on the nerves on the spinal cord. Okay. Now, for any anesthesia, you have to know what is the use of this anesthesia, how is it given, what are the side effects and the complications after giving this spinal anesthesia, and etc. So first, what are the indications? I told you in the beginning that any short duration surgery below the umbilicus, we go for spinal anesthesia. So what are the examples of these two surgeries, and what do you mean by short duration? Short duration means 2 to 3 hours of surgery below the umbilicus. For example, appendicectomy, LUCS, that is lower uterine cesarean section, hernia operation, hydrocele operation. These are some of the examples of short duration surgeries below anesthesia, below umbilicus, where you give spinal anesthesia. How to give spinal anesthesia? Again, a very important question. So, the patient can be in two positions. First, the patient can either be in sitting position. If the patient cannot sit, the patient can be in the lateral position. Okay. After the patient is properly seated, you have to choose the site of giving spinal anesthesia, and this is determined by Taffier's line. What is Taffier's line, and how will you identify that? Suppose a patient is sitting. What you will do, you will put your hands on the iliac crest of the patient. You will put your hands on the prominent part of the iliac crest of the patient. Okay. Your two thumbs will be pointing towards each other. That imaginary line where your two thumbs are passing by, that is called as the Taffier's line. Okay. Now, what does this Taffier line signify? It signifies the L3 and the L5 space. That means that line is passing somewhere between the L3 and L5 space, and that is the most ideal place of giving ideal place of giving spinal anesthesia. Because now if I just tell you that you put the spinal anesthesia in L3, L5 space, you will not be able to understand. But if you identify the Taffier's line by putting your hands on the prominent part of the iliac crest and your thumb pointing towards each other, you will be able to understand that Taffier's line and the L3, L5 space. So that is the location where you give spinal anesthesia. Now, you will insert your needle. You will reach the subarachnoid space. You will barbotage after going to the subarachnoid space, and then you will give the spinal anesthesia. So there is a question which comes that while you are inserting the needle through the L3, L5 space, what are the structures you pierce? And the second question that comes, that what is the needle that you are using? So the needle that you are using is the Duras separating needle, which is a thin bore needle. Okay, you can watch this image of the Duras separating needle in the Google also, but I will try putting it here. Okay, what are the structures that are pierced? Obviously, you have the skin first, then you have the subcutaneous tissue, then you have the supraspinous ligament, then you have the infraspinous ligament. This infraspinous ligament is also called as the interspinous ligament. Then you have the ligamentum flavum. This is important to be noted because ligamentum flavum is the toughest ligament that you are piercing. Then you will hear a snap because you will hear a sound because it is the toughest ligament. So you will hear a sound or sudden loss of resistance. After that, you know that you have gone into the dura mater. After the dura mater, you go into the arachnoid mater. After arachnoid mater, you go into the subarachnoid space. And when you are in the subarachnoid space, you will see that the CSF is drizzling out. That means you have reached the correct place. When the CSF drizzles out, you put in your local anesthesia. That is in the subarachnoid space. Now, I told you that after your needle is in the subarachnoid space, you have to barbotage before giving the regional spinal anesthesia. So what does barbotage means? It means that once your needle is in the subarachnoid space, you aspirate 1 to 2 ml of CSF and then you inject the local anesthesia. So it means that if you have reached the subarachnoid space, you can see that CSF is drizzling out. You will aspirate 1 to 2 ml of CSF and then you will administer the local anesthesia. This is called as barbotage. Now, repeatedly I am saying that you have reached the subarachnoid space, you give the local anesthesia, but which local anesthetics are to be given as regional anesthesia? So you can use two of them. One is bupivacaine and second is lignocaine. Bupivacaine is longer acting than lignocaine, hence it is most commonly used, but otherwise lignocaine is the second most common used local anesthetic that is given as spinal anesthesia. Okay. Now, one thing that you have to know that local anesthetics usually act for a very short duration of time. So you have to give certain substances along with local anesthesia in case of spinal anesthesia so that the duration of the action of local anesthesia increases. These substances are called as additives. To increase the duration of local anesthetics for spinal anesthesia, you have to give additives. Now, basically opioids are given. Which opioids are given? Fentanyl, morphine and sufentanil. These three are the opioids which are commonly given. But you should remember, don't give remifentanil because it is neurotoxic preservative. It is having a neurotoxic preservative. So avoid giving remifentanil as an additive in case of spinal anesthesia. Okay, now you have to know the side effects of spinal anesthesia. First is nausea and vomiting. Easy to remember. Second, respiratory depression. Any anesthesia will kind of have respiratory depression. So put that in. But the third thing which you have to remember is pruritus. And this is the most common side effect with spinal anesthesia. So clear? Nausea, vomiting, respiratory depression, pruritus. Now we move on to the complications of spinal anesthesia, a very important topic. We classify the complications into two broad headings, intra-op classifications and post-op classifications. What is intra-op classifications? The complications of spinal anesthesia that is occurring during the OT. And post-op, as the name says, it is post-operation, that is post-OT. Okay. What are the intra-Pacific complications that we should know about? First is hypotension, that is low blood pressure, and this is the most common complication. Then you have the bradycardia. Then you have the shivering. Why there is shivering? Because there is vasodilation of the vessels of the lower limb after you give spinal anesthesia, hence there is shivering. Fourth, there is high spinal anesthesia. Then there is total spinal anesthesia. Then is the respiratory depression, and then there is cardiac arrest. Now, what is high spinal anesthesia? See, high spinal anesthesia means that when the achieved level of anesthesia or when the achieved level of the drug is higher than the desired level, this is called as high spinal anesthesia. And what is total spinal anesthesia? Total spinal anesthesia is high spinal anesthesia plus the spinal anesthesia has gone into CSF. Okay. Now, how will you manage these intra-op complications? For management, you have something called as emergency drug tray. I told you that hypotension is the most common intra-op complication which occurs in spinal anesthesia. For that, you have phenylephrine in the emergency drug tray. If there is bradycardia, you have atropine. If there is shivering, you have pethidine. For respiratory depression, there is laryngoscope and provisions for intubation of the patient. And for cardiac arrest, you have adrenaline. Now, you should remember that if the patient is on monoamine oxidase inhibitors, please don't give him pethidine. Okay. So this is the management of the intra-op complications of spinal anesthesia. Now, what are the post-op complications? Very important to remember, there is a case of acute retention of urine, and this is the most common post-op complication. Like hypertension was the most common intra-op complication, acute retention of urine is the most common post-op complication. Why does this occur? This occurs because of the blockage of the sacral segments. Clear? Also, there can be headache of the patient, and there can be sixth cranial nerve palsy. Now, we'll see how to manage this headache particularly. Management of headache in case of spinal anesthesia is mostly a conservative management. How will you manage conservatively? Using caffeine, NSAIDs, or intravenous fluids. If this conservative management doesn't work, you have to go for definite management, that is epidural blood patch of the patient. Clear? Now, this was the side effects of these were the complications of spinal anesthesia. Now, there are some contraindications of spinal anesthesia. Now, just have a logic. I told you that spinal anesthesia causes hypotension. So, the patient is already in shock. Will you give him or her spinal anesthesia? No. So, first, this patient is in shock. Because then, if the hypotension occurs, the patient will go into circulatory collapse. Second, there is already headache of the patient. So, if the patient is having raised intracranial tension, this will cause herniation of the meninges for the very bad attack of headache. Third, if there is infection or any trauma at the site where you give spinal anesthesia, obviously you will not be doing that. And fifth reason is coagulopathy. If the patient is having some bleeding disorders, we don't try to do any invasive procedures. Okay, so this completes our spinal anesthesia. We now move on to epidural anesthesia. Next up, we study about the epidural anesthesia. So like any anesthesia, we have to know what is the use of this anesthesia, how is it given, what are the side effects and the complications. So I told you before that epidural anesthesia is used for below the umbilical surgeries but the long duration surgeries. Okay, so what are these surgeries? This can be the total hip replacement, the painless labor and the total knee replacement. Now, what is the procedure? How do we give the epidural anesthesia? So, the procedure is that first a needle is introduced into the epidural space. That is why it is called as the epidural anesthesia, because the needle is inserted into the epidural space. Then, you introduce a catheter. Now, one end of the catheter is introduced into the epidural space and the other part of the catheter is outside. And from this part, which is outside, you give the top-up doses of the drugs. So, there are two differences of epidural anesthesia from spinal anesthesia in the procedure. First, you have to enter into the epidural space, but in spinal anesthesia, you are entering into the subarachnoid space. And here there is a role of catheter because you want to give the top-up doses from outside. But in spinal anesthesia, there was no use of catheter. Okay, and here the needle is called as the Tuhois 18-gauge epidural needle. Now, what are the structures that appears in epidural anesthesia? It is the same as subarachnoid space, but just that we go up to the ligamentum flavum. We don't go to the subarachnoid space here. We just limit ourselves to the epidural space. Now, one thing you have to remember that epidural anesthesia, as I told you, is used in case of painless labor. So here, the dose of bupivacaine and the lignocaine that you give is 0.0625% to 0.125%, and this is used for sensory block and not motor block. That is why this dose is used in case of painless labor. Now, we will discuss about two more other types of anesthesia, that is saddle anesthesia and caudal anesthesia. Now, in case of saddle anesthesia, the procedure is just like spinal anesthesia. That is, we will make the person sit. Do not make the person lie down. Okay? The person is made to sit for 8 minutes because we want to here introduce the anesthetic materials into the saddle part. Okay? And this is used in those surgeries which are related to anal fistula and hemorrhoids. Okay? What about caudal anesthesia? And why is it called so? Caudal anesthesia is when the anesthetic drugs are given in the caudal epidural space. Okay? At the level of the sacral hiatus. And this is given in case of pediatric cases. Right? So we have done local anesthesia. We have done regional anesthesia, 4 types: spinal, epidural, caudal and saddle. Now we move on to the regional nerve blocks or the peripheral nerve blocks. I told you 4, but here we will preferably do 2 of them which are most important. First is the brachial plexus block and the second is the stellate ganglion block. Questions are not asked from the femoral block and the ankle block, but you just have to remember the names. So first, the brachial plexus block. Now, what is the role of the brachial plexus? Brachial plexus gives the sensation and motor supply to the upper limb. Okay, so that means we are blocking the sensations and the motor supply to the upper limb. What are the roots of the brachial plexus? C5 to T1, that is C5, C6, C7, C8 and T1. And what is the indication of the brachial plexus block? If there is any break in the hand or in any part of the hand, then we give the brachial plexus block. Okay, there are two routes by which you can give the brachial plexus block. One is the interscalene route and other is the supraclavicular route. And there is one axillary route as well. So three routes are there. Let's see one by one in details. Interscalene route. That means inter matlab in between. Scalene means scalene muscles. So interscalene route is between the two scalene muscles. What are the two scalene muscles? Anterior scalene muscle and the middle scalene muscle. Okay, remember that while you are giving the nerve block through the interscalene route, we are just blocking the proximal roots of the brachial plexus. What are the proximal roots? C5, C6, C7. So, in case of interscalene roots, the proximal roots are blocked. So this can be used only for proximal arm surgeries. It is evident, quite evident. If you block the proximal roots, you can use it for proximal arm surgeries. The distal roots here are not blocked. That means C8 and T1 is not blocked here. That is why you will not use this block when there is a ulnar nerve damage. Okay, because ulnar nerve involves the C8 and the T1. Now, what is the complication through this route? The complication is that phrenic nerve can be damaged and that can lead to diaphragmatic palsy because diaphragm is supplied by the phrenic nerve. Okay, the next approach is the supraclavicular route. Here, all the roots are blocked. That means C5, C6, C7, C8 and T1. All the roots are blocked. So, this route can be used for all the surgeries of the upper limb. Okay, what is the complication here? Complication is pneumothorax because while you approach the needle through the supraclavicular route, the pleura is involved and it can cause pneumothorax. And last is the axillary approach or axillary route. Here, only the distal roots are blocked. And this is used for hand and forearm surgeries. So what is the problem here? As the distal roots are only involved, the musculocutaneous nerve is spared here. Okay. Now let's move on to stellate ganglion block, another type of peripheral nerve block. Now what is the indication of this stellate ganglion block? The indication is the Raynaud's disease, which is not responsive to the peripheral vasodilators. And the second indication is drug-induced or catheter-induced vasospasm. So if there is Raynaud's disease which cannot be cured by peripheral vasodilators, we use the stellate ganglion block. And second, if there is vasospasm due to drug-induced or catheter-induced, you can do this as well. Now where is the stellate ganglion located? Stellate ganglion is located in the anterior border of the C6 vertebra, and that is what we are blocking here. And this stellate ganglion is responsible for the activity of the face, neck and upper limb. Okay. Now after giving the stellate ganglion block, what are the signs? There are three signs: Horner syndrome, Muller sign, Gutman sign. What is Horner syndrome? Horner syndrome is a combination of three things: meiosis, ptosis and hydrosis. What is Muller sign? Muller sign is the vasodilation of the tympanic membrane. What is Gutman sign? Gutman sign is the vasodilation of the nasal mucosa. So I hope the stellate ganglion block is clear now. Now there are two things which are related to brachial plexus block, that is Erb's palsy and Klumpke's palsy. You should read it as well. Okay. So this covers our anesthesia crash course part 1, where we have discussed the history of anesthesia, the techniques of anesthesia, that is the local anesthesia, the regional anesthesia, and we have also discussed the pre-anesthetic checkup. In the next part of the anesthesia crash course 2, part 2, we will discuss the general anesthesia.